Welcome to the Research Reimagined podcast, brought to you by Nottingham Trent University. I'm your host, Helen Darby-Dowman, and I'll be inviting some of NTU's brightest minds to explore how their research is helping us to deepen our understanding of the world. From online addictions to transgender rights and sleep disorders. Listen as we discuss some of society's most pressing challenges and uncover some of the ways our research is making a difference. In the UK, Black History Month happens every October, giving everyone the opportunity to share, celebrate and understand the impact of Black heritage and culture. As October is drawing to a close, we've brought together speakers from NTU to reflect on Black History Month and the ideas, issues and concerns that drive and inspire their research in the US and UK. I'm joined by Panya Banjoko and Professor Sharon Monteith from our School of Arts and Humanities. Panya completed her PhD here in 2022 and has lectured here in creative writing and practice. She is a renowned poet and a key figure in Nottingham's arts and culture community. She founded the Nottingham Black Archive. Sharon is a distinguished professor of American literature and cultural history, and her interdisciplinary research focuses on literary activism, African American and Black British print and visual culture, the American South, the US civil rights movement and massive resistance to civil rights in the 1950s and 1960s. Hi Sharon, hi Panya, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleased to be here, thank you.
We're nearing the end of Black History Month, which takes place in October every year. What do you think about Black History Month as a concept?
I guess neither of us think that it should last a month, but there were good reasons why it did in the first place. It was an African American concept, was brought together in order to showcase Black historical writing and writing by Black people at a time when that was absolutely needed. I think it continues to be needed. It will always be needed, probably. But for us, I mean, obviously, it takes place in February in the US, October in the UK, and we took it up in the 1980s.
I'm not quite sure, actually.
I think. I mean, it's longer ago than we think.
Yeah.
That we started doing this, but I mean, for us, it's been Black History 365, hasn't it? Not which of Nottingham Trent University does inspire and adhere to, as opposed to Black History Month. So I guess it's what we're doing full time, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. I mean, yeah, I know that I personally have been delivering workshops or talks, etc., on Black History Month from the early 90s. So that gives you some indication of the timing. But in terms of, is it something... in looking at whether the month and whether it's a good thing or not. Yes, it's good in the sense that what it does at this period of time is it raises awareness of issues and the history of Black people's contribution to the world. It would be good to see it move into being something that's integrated and is not necessarily celebrated over 31 days, but actually permeates 365. Yeah, I think what we need to move to is seeing Black History Month as world history. And this kind of division of seeing it as a particular piece of history that has to sit in a particular way, rather than actually it's world history, it's everybody's history. Everybody should know about the contributions of all people to humanity and civilization. So I'd really like to see it progressing along those lines.
I mean, I know when I was doing a little bit of reading, it was talked, say, in some of the articles I read about, was that obviously is a lot about the education, certainly say for younger people and with schools, and that actually it doesn't have to be just obviously the month of October. I mean, schools have a free rein to introduce Black history into all walks of their history lessons. I mean, is this kind of what, when you say, it needs to be all year round, is that kind of where you're thinking in terms of the education side of it?
Absolutely. I mean, if you study the sciences, I wonder how many budding scientists will come up against people like Lewis Howard Latimer. And if you're studying nursing, do you come up across Mary Seacole? So these histories could be embedded into the curriculum to help add texture to it and to show the things that Black people have done. Charles Drew, who develop the mechanism for storing blood so that we can give people today blood transfusion. So these are things that should be studied as part of a nursing qualification or a part of the sciences, but they're not. And I don't understand why something as important as that isn't highlighted. That's what I don't understand.
I think the point is that it's all our history, and that, we may choose to segment it out and think that awareness is still very necessary, because it is really necessary. I think the difficulty is whether schools do have the freedom to introduce or see that they do, because in these years, I was a school teacher in the very early 1980s, and we had a lot more freedom then to teach what we liked. So that, in the classroom, if students started to talk on a particular issue, you might decide, well, they need to talk about that. Let's talk about that. Whereas the national curriculum and all its permutations has made education more rigid, in my view. I'm thinking back to the 1970s. It was always To Kill a Mockingbird that featured on the school curriculum, wasn't it? So that, if you were going to talk about race, then that was where you were going to talk about it, in the work of a white writer published in 1960 and set in the 1930s, so safely packaged in the past and in the US, not in the UK. So that you would talk about racism, how to walk in someone else's shoes was the kind of moral that came through the text. But I don't remember the curriculum being much more diverse when I was a student. It certainly was when I was a teacher, because you could choose to make it so. But I'm often looking through the literary texts that students study and thinking, it's still not happened. It's still not as diverse as it should be. It's not as inclusive as it should be. And I guess you can't think about Black history, however many ideas there are within that, African, Caribbean, Africa, and the whole kind of continent is very complex, without thinking about the history of white supremacy, without thinking about slavery and colonialism, without understanding that some of the very real historical and material realities that drive us thinking about Black history are also inextricably bound up with the ideology of white supremacy. And, white privilege is not a new thing. It's always been encoded within systems and processes. So I think we want to inspire, and the people that Panya was talking about are truly inspiring, and people don't know enough about them. Mary Seacole maybe.
Yes, maybe a little bit more about her. What I tend to find with Black History Month and how it is curated by mainstream organisations is that it generally centres around trauma. So we'll look at colonialism, we'll look at slavery, etc. And that can be off-putting for Black people who are part of an establishment or an educational institution when this is the area of Black history that's being studied. And I feel there needs to be a much broader thinking about what can be studied or discussed at Black History Month time. So I think things like debates around should the Colston statue have been defaced and pulled down or not. I think these are...
Should it be put in the museum?
Exactly.
Should it be put with something else?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think that we can, modernise Black History Month and talk about current issues and use that as a framework to then look at colonial history and so on. So there's a lot there that still needs to be tinkered with.
So do you feel it's very boxed? Like subjects are kind of quite linear, rather than actually, like you was discussing then, that you kind of cross everything together and it becomes a far more of a conversation rather than little snippets of education?
I think the UK has a particular way of celebrating Black history, and it seems to always lean towards America. So if you're studying, looking at Black History Month here in the UK, you're going to come across Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. Rosa Parks.
Yes.
You're going to come across these as though there are no substantive black heroes here in the UK. And that, again, is an issue. But what was you going to say?
I was going to say two things. One, you've made me think from saying that, we have delivered lectures about the civil rights movement in the UK in the 1960s. We often go back to the Bristol bus boycott in 1963 as an obvious example. But, we've done that. I think it's absolutely true that kids in UK schools know more about African American history and the civil rights movement in the US than they do about the UK. And that's inevitable in some ways, but we do need to address that, and we need to continually address that. I think the other thing I was going to say about Black history in the UK is when you talk about it being made more complicated or more inclusive, I think we do need to understand that that history includes things like Islamophobia, that there are black Muslims. In other words, that the global majority is more complex than just thinking, what do we mean when we talk about black? And it's not a monolith. It's a heterogeneous category if we use it and choose to use it in the same way that white is. And white is a race and an identity, and it's also hugely complex. So I think there's a lot for us to think about always.
Just while we're still talking about kind of this Black History Month aspect, obviously it did start in the US. What is the differences, say, that you would see between what they do in the US and how that's evolved? Because it started a long time before it did in the UK, and what how it migrated into the UK or how we took it on.
Although I deliver workshops around Black History Month and do lots of talks, etc., I don't personally involve myself in it in that way because I just don't, for a variety of different reasons. I mean, the one of the things that I will say in comparison between the UK and the US in Black History Month is that at least here in the UK we have the longest month, one of the longest months to celebrate it. But in the US they only have 28, maybe possibly 29 days in which to celebrate it, and I'm sure that has an impact. I do sometimes get tired with Black History Month, although I understand its importance in raising awareness, because I feel we need to be moving beyond that, and I want to steer conversations and discussions to how we can move beyond what it is now, which is this celebration over 31 days here in the UK. And I know some organisations like Nottingham Trent University are trying to say, look, it's Black History Month 365, but we haven't quite migrated into that yet. And for us to begin looking not so much at Black history, but incorporating this into world history. So I'm slightly frustrated as a Black person with why are we not moving on? Because like I said, from the early 1990s, I've been doing what I'm doing now, which is 30 years, just over 30 years on. So it becomes a little bit tedious for me.
So do you feel the progression actually hasn't really gone that far?
No, I don't think it has, because we called then, and you can really interrupt me, Sharon, and tell me I'm wrong, but we called then for the Black history to be part of the school curriculum, and it isn't. It happens on an ad hoc basis, depending on whether you have a good teacher in place who will diversify their curriculum for their particular class. So we haven't really moved on in terms of that. And I would like to see something much more sustainable, much more embedded within the structures of this society, rather than just this frilly thing that happens once a month. I mean, Audre Lorde, when she talks about change, she talks about not just this a slight shift. She talks about concrete changes, and that's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see the government saying this should be studied by all schools here in the UK. And this is the responsibility of all organisations and educational institutions. This is where I'd like to see it progress to.
There's a very interesting article I was reading the other day, and I've been trying to rack my brains as to who wrote it. But it's about the importance of representing Black leisure, rest, people being quiet, people being happy. And obviously you can look at visual culture, art, film, media, for representations of that. But I think it comes back to this idea that history is not always and only about trauma, and that subjective histories are really important, and community histories. And, you know, the warmth and the support within communities as well, within families. So I think, you know, that's something else that we perhaps don't always get time for. I do think that we do follow the US in terms of focusing on the key civil rights leaders, known names. And one of the things that Panya and I have always been trying to do is to tell the story of unsung activists. They're often community activists. They're often people that we need to recover. So we often think of what we do as recovery research, because we need to try to uncover stories that benefit communities and that we need to hear, and, you know, give back stories to people. And that's one of the things that, Panya, you've been doing with Nottingham Black Archive in particular, and some of the projects around that. Did you want to say something about that?
Absolutely, absolutely. For example, Oswald George Powell, you know, we've been able to get his name more well known. He was a World War II radar operator. After his service in the Royal Air Force, he then came to England, and he began a lifelong career of campaigning for racial equality and justice. He was instrumental in diversing Valley Industries' employment practices. Amongst many other things, he helped to establish the first African Caribbean Community Centre here in the city, helped to set up campaigning groups like the Black People's Freedom Movement, worked towards supporting Black children through the supplementary school movement as well. So he did a lot that benefited families and communities here in this city. And not many people knew about him until Nottingham Black Archive started to spread that information. And he's one of the people, and there's people like Leonora Arboyne as well, and the work that she has done with the Black supplementary school movement and in schools as well. She used to work in a secondary school here in the city, and she helped to diversify the curriculum there and do peer-to-peer learning with teachers as well, so that they could then go on and deliver a diverse curriculum. So we have all of these wonderful people here in Nottingham doing all of this fantastic work, but they're always in the shadow because we cast our eye towards the US for role models and heroes, which I don't understand why.
So Panya, tell us a little bit more maybe about the Nottingham Black Archive. Like, how did it come about, and kind of how did you find all this information, and a little bit more actually how you share that within the city would be really nice.
Well, Nottingham Black Archive was founded in 2009, and it came about because of my disillusionment with the heritage sector here in Nottingham. What was happening at that point is whenever the heritage sector decided to do something around Black history, heritage or culture, it was always a particular strand of that, and it was generally around slavery. There was nothing that really documented or charted our campaigning activities here in the city, or how we coped with being in an environment that was hostile towards us during Windrush phase, 1948 and through the 60s and the 70s. And so disillusioned with that, I felt that, well, the best thing to do, as Audre Lorde says, is use that anger, for agency. And so the logical thing to do was to set up an archive. And that's what happened. The community donates things to it, we accession it in, and we make it accessible in a variety of different ways through exhibitions. So we've had exhibitions at Bonington Gallery, for example, touring exhibitions that's gone to Derby, Leicester and London. And more recently, I was at Binks Yard doing a pop-up. I had a pop-up archive, so we had some of the artifacts out in the open. I made sure that they were safe. It was on a glorious day, so that the community can come and see that. We have publications as well. We produce films and I do talks, and so it's made accessible in all those different ways.
And what kind of impact have you seen so far from it?
I think there's been a massive impact. It was actually on Tuesday. I was doing a talk at Bromley House Library, and I was talking about how I harnessed my anger, because I was very angry at the heritage sector here in Nottingham for not representing my culture in a meaningful way, especially as we've contributed through our services to not only World War II, but World War I and many other ways, the National Health Service, etc. So I was very angry about that.
This work that Panya did was also the subject of your PhD study. So she mined the archive she created. And I think thinking about Nottingham Black Archive is sometimes thinking about Black history too, because stories are fragmented. They're not easy to piece together, to find. And, I've trawled through lots of archives, usually in the US, in order to recover the histories that I write. But what Panya needed to do was basically to scan the city, all those people accessioning. You've even had tall boys, sideboards full of things donated, haven't you, as well as people's papers and photographs and...
Yes, and someone has a small desk that belonged to Len Garrison.
Oh, great.
That they're going to be donating to the archive, and also some poetry, unpublished poetry, but poetry that Len Garrison wrote during
Unpublished
his
poetry?
during his tenure at the ACFF Centre. So just imagine how that's going to inform.
So Garrison was really important.
Yes,
because he was asking the Black community, where are our monuments?
Yes, absolutely. But going back to the point of what impact this has on the city, I've noticed since Nottingham Black Archive was founded in 2009 that the Black community itself has got much more pride in its history and its culture. So you see lots more projects popping up around Black history and culture. In terms of the heritage sector, I think what Nottingham Black Archive did was to embarrass them because there was a gap in their provision. So it embarrassed them. And because of that, then they do reach out to the archive and ask us to do various pieces of work with them. So it's had that impact where it's made organisations, or some organisations, think a little bit more about what they provide.
And, you're saying you're uncovering this history of local people, of real heroes, things that activists within their heritage. Is that something that's happening wider than just Nottingham?
I mean, you've got Black Cultural Archives, which is the national archive, and then there are different organisations around the country. So in Northamptonshire, they have a Black History Project there. In Birmingham, the Black Archive is really centred around Vanley Burke. He's a documentary photographer, and he's been documenting the Black community for, I think, something like 60 years. He's been doing that. So it's very much centred around his archive, but his archive is also part of Birmingham Library, so it's migrating now into the mainstream archives. Yes, there is an archive in Sheffield, and new ones springing up all the time. I know that Derby is also developing an archive there, and Leicester is developing an archive there too. So they are springing up around the country.
One of the really good projects of many that Nottingham Black Archive did that I remember in particular was about World War One soldiers. And the reason that I'd highlight this project is because Panya's work in Nottingham Black Archive is one of the few, I think, that has been inclusive of the South Asian community in the city as well. So this was a project that brought together people whose ancestors had fought in World War One. Sometimes their fathers or their grandfathers, their uncles, had fought in World War One, but from Africa, the Caribbean, India, what is now Pakistan. And so it brought together the city around trying to recover the stories of some of these soldiers, partly because they'd been forgotten, because there was a horrible history around cannon fodder, and there were some demonstrations against brutality. There were some difficulties. There was a lot of bravery. But one of the things that really struck me emotionally was that Nottingham Black Archive managed to recover the history of one individual soldier who'd been born in Jamaica and finally settled in Nottingham, his family. And his daughter was quite elderly at the time, and Nottingham Black Archive returned to her the documents that could be found about her father's service and celebrated him for his bravery in a way that was incredibly moving to that lady. And she died shortly afterwards, didn't she?
Yes, yeah. And I like to think that we gave her some peace because she'd been bottling up this anger she was in her 80s. So she'd been bottling up this anger since her childhood, that her father had volunteered to fight in the British West Indian Regiment. So it was a volunteer regiment. He's not being paid to do this. Was treated badly. If you know anything about the British West Indian Regiment, you know that when soldiers went from the Caribbean, they weren't given appropriate clothing. Many suffered from frostbite. Many had to have limbs amputated as a result of that. He was, it's war, so he's not facing a happy time. He's facing brutality. He comes back to the Caribbean suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and never gets any kind of care for that. And then to add insult to injury, when war is being commemorated, whether it's World War One or World War Two, the black troops are forgotten. And so she was very angry about this. And we gave her some peace because we celebrated, we commemorated his contribution to the First World War. And that's, again, something that the mainstream should have been doing. They were very happy to have, all, as you said, Sharon, all of this cannon fodder, but didn't really treat people with the dignity and respect that they deserve.
The World War One project was under the auspices of the Arts and Humanities Research Council. So it was one of those examples where, as an academic, I could apply for the funding, but the project was led by Panya, the Nottingham Black Archive. So the work was conducted in the main by Nottingham Black Archive. And I think that's one of the really good examples of universities and partner organisations working together to do what the partner organisation wants to have happen, not necessarily what the university feels it might. That seems to me the purpose of collaborative partnerships. I think the other thing about this project is that it was dealing with difficult emotions. And that, I think, is something that both of us do. So although Panya's been talking about perhaps trauma shouldn't be at the centre of what we do, at the same time, we are always recognising the kind of difficult emotions, whether they are rage or anger or resentment or upset, because they are historical, they're material, there are good reasons for those emotions. So I think the kinds of histories that we look at can't ignore those either. And the World War One project was totally inspiring. In fact, it was the first time, wasn't it, Panya, that the black poppy wreath was laid formally in the city of Nottingham as a result of that project. So that inclusivity about recognising other histories was evident in that moment too.
When did when did this take place?
The project was part of the Arts and Humanities Research Council's Hidden Histories idea, and it took place over 2016 to 2017. In fact, I think the research started in 2016, and then the touring exhibition that came out of it began touring and finished in December 2017 because it finished at Black Cultural Archive in London after having toured, obviously, Nottingham, most of the libraries, so community centres. So it really was by the people, for the people, in many ways.
I mean, can you talk to me a little bit about some of the responses you get from the communities with the work that you're doing when you're uncovering this this history? You know, bring some of that to life for us.
Although lots of the methods and approaches that we share cross over between the US and the UK, my work has been more for communities in the US. So in terms of my last book, which was about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was founded in 1960 in the US South. And it came together through students who'd been on the Freedom Rides, the sit-ins in 1960, the Freedom Rides in 1961, and who came together and embedded themselves in some of the most recalcitrant places in the US South. So in African American communities where people were not allowed to vote, where they weren't allowed to register to vote, where they were under threat, constant racial terrorism. And, you know, these were very courageous young people then. And there had already been at least 2 really good histories of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, one by Clay Carson and the other by Wesley Hogan. But what I discovered and what I started to trace was that this organisation had a narrative culture, a print culture, a literary history, a literary legacy. And that wasn't, people didn't know about that. That wasn't something that was discussed in those books. And it came about because I started to picture the fact that it seemed very strange to me originally that while people were embedded in these places, working on voter registration drives, setting up freedom schools, that they could even have the time to write. But they were writing novels, poetry, short stories, all kinds of things. And then I came across something by Julian Bond. He was the communications director for the organisation. And he said that people in projects in southwest Georgia were writing furiously like frustrated novelists. And I thought, that's interesting. And tracing it, it was clear that what he actually meant was their field reports. So this was a very writerly organisation. Every time they went into a project, they would write a report that distilled what was happening. They'd send it back to the head office. They'd be asking for supplies, more money, more help. They'd be saying how many people they registered to vote that week. And everybody was told to write it down, keep writing it down. But reports, press releases, affidavits, these can be very cramped containers for people who want to write. And a lot of these people had studied history, literature, philosophy at university, politics, or dropped out to become activists. So it became clear that they wanted to pursue their lived experience and that of the communities with which they were working in different forms, and that fiction can often be a very safe space to explore ideas that are really difficult otherwise to talk about. So some of those emotions, the difficulties, the regret, the anger, the frustration, denial and delay, whether it's the federal government, the murder of your peers, you know, all those things were really emotional. So over years, probably took me about 10 years to kind of put together this history. And I think why it mattered for the group was that SNCC activists now, and they have a legacy project, SNCC Digital, which is truly amazing. They're in charge of their own narrative very much now. But what became apparent was they really didn't know that their colleagues, their peers, were writing about them. You know, demonstrations they'd been in, experiences they shared. I don't think they were even aware of themselves often as creative, imaginative writers. So if somebody wrote a history, journalism, that seemed to be valued. But the idea that activism happens in literary forms was less apparent. So I think what I wanted to do for the group was to give that literary history back, to say, there is one. SNCC has a substantial literary history. And what really pleased me was that the activists bought copies, gifted them to their children, especially the writers in SNCC. And the project was even cited to help support a Freedom House in Atlanta to make it a listed building. So I think sometimes you're working on your own, as I was. You're mining all those archives, but you do have a sense of who it might benefit if you can tell the stories that you're trying to piece together.
Yeah, I agree. And with you talking there, it's making me think about here in Nottingham and the fact that through my PhD, I added texture to the fact that Nottingham was a regional branch of the Caribbean artist movement, which was a seminal movement, a collective of artists spanning many different disciplines that came into being in the 1960s, spearheaded by Dr. Edward Kamal Brathwaite. And when I see students, when I do a talk and I see students actually, realizing that the Black literary history, the Black artist history is much longer than we've been told it is. I've heard many times academics too saying there is no Black literary history here in the city, but I've proved that to be not the case. And in fact, earliest examples of political literature you can find here being published right here in Nottingham from the mid-1950s. So we do have that history, and we have that history of connecting with collectives nationally and internationally. So it's really good for the community when they can see actually, well, no, we do have a longer history, and it's an important history, and then that hopefully will inspire them to go on and create more history. That's what I'm hoping.
I mean, Panya, I know that you've written a lot of poetry. Can you tell us a bit about that and kind of where it comes from and how you create it, and also kind of the impact that that's had?
Yes, certainly. My first collection of poetry, which was published in 2018, and is called Some Things. I think that is a collection that really embodies the frustration and anger of being a second generation. What do you call me? Migrant, immigrant? I don't know what I'm. Born in this country, British. I don't know what I am. So it captures the frustration and the anger there. My second publication now delves more into archives and is trying to make a creative intervention by trying to bridge that gap between what mainstream archives hold and what is hidden. So it's bringing to life some of those hidden voices and amplifying them. But in the main, I have been known for writing poetry that is issue-based and speaks about social injustice and racism in particular. I think, and going back to what we talked about at the beginning, where Black History Month can sometimes be a month where all that is happening is we're showing trauma. I think there's part of that not wanting to perpetuate the trauma for the younger generation coming through and offering them something new. That my third collection that's in progress actually steps completely away from activism and racism, etc., and deals with much more global themes like love and relationships. And I think maybe I just need that downtime away from all the hard stuff to do that. But also thinking about it, I've been thinking about this more recently, because I have been thinking, why am I writing love poetry? I mean, who am I? Why am I doing this? This is not who I am. But the reason came to me because after the murder of George Floyd, I was one of the people, amongst many, who went and protested at the Forest Recreation Ground. It was really filled with people, and I went. Well, of course, we observed social distancing, and we had our masks on, etc. And for a tiny moment, I actually saw a glimmer. It was only a tiny moment, and it was only a glimmer that racism could perhaps end for a time, because there were so many people on the Forest Recreation Ground, and people from all different walks of life, academics, working class, elderly, young, black, white, South Asian. There were so many different people. And for me, that was the first time I had witnessed the white community standing as allies and in solidarity with the black community around a racial issue. So that was an overwhelming moment, and I had a tiny space to breathe. And what I can remember saying to myself at the Forest, if racism ends, well, then what will I write about? What would I explore? And I think that was the seed that made me begin to think, although I think it's important to narrate racial injustice, I don't want to be bound to do that all the time, because then I'm not experiencing the full spectrum of who I am and what I can offer the world, or exploring greater depth my poetry, my thoughts and my visions. And so I think I'm going in different directions because I need that freedom to explore my creativity as an artist without the restraints and shackles of racism holding me back. That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have a favourite poem or a favourite line that you've written? Anything that kind of, when you read it, makes you, is very emotive, because you've obviously been through a real journey.
Yes. Yes. Oh, does this sound wrong? I have lots of favourite lines in my poetry.
I know. I was trying to extract one from you.
Oh no, it'd be very difficult for me to pull one right now at this moment.
That's my favourite
Is
poem.
that your favourite one? Yes. But I've written a rant poem since then. You haven't seen any of my new work, Sharon. I've written a rant poem, and there's lines in that I absolutely love. I've also written recently written a dub poem as well, so that's got a nice rhythm to it. We mew for you, we do for you, sometimes we turn fool for you. It goes like that's the rhythm of that. So I'm just exploring and experimenting and being free at the moment.
It's really interesting because one of the things with performance poetry, because you just began to perform there,
Yes.
You couldn't help it, is that it's really been very difficult to recover that history, because there used to be such a lot of performance poetry in Nottingham, and we went to a lot of it in the 1980s. Panya performed a lot. There is a little video of her actually walking down the Nottingham street, looking very young indeed as she chants her poetry. But that's the exception that proves the rule, really, that we have so much we can't recover, because pre-internet, everything else, as different kinds of technology die, replaced so often, we've lost a lot of this. And there's a real difference between poetry on the page and poetry and performance. And so how you feel in that room, or how people join in, as they sometimes do, with the poems, that's lost. And so I think it's really important that we try to find some of that history. I'm wondering whether people have got old videotapes of performance poetry, whether they might even donate them to Nottingham Black Archive if they know that they're hanging around somewhere. But that's one of the elements that we've been talking about quite a lot, and just wish that we could recover more of that history.
Obviously, both of you have researched for many years in your obviously subject areas. If you were to sort of take all of that, everything you've done, where would you hope that perhaps the next 10 years will take us?
I have to say that I am in no way a great researcher like Sharon. Sharon is a distinguished professor and has been researching much more longer than me, and so I actually see Sharon more as a mentor. So I'm just going to take that bit out of that question about being a researcher for a very long time. I don't think I have been. But what would I like to see in the next 10 years? For me, I would like to see the Black community embracing more the history of their culture here in the city and using it to make forward steps. So for me, this is all part of why I'm doing the research that I do, because I strongly believe that this knowledge of the past can inform the future. It certainly informs my future. When you are armed with this knowledge, so you know more clearly the impact and influence of colonialism on you and how it shapes and misshapes, then you can negotiate and navigate that much more better, I hope. When you know that you come from a history of great poets, great orators, singers, musicians, artists, academics, intellectuals, then hopefully that will inspire you to move on, because we are often told that there aren't any Black writers, or there aren't any Black academics, or there aren't any Black intellectuals. And so if I can present these to the Black community, hopefully they will grow in confidence and stature and go on to make changes within the system. So my focus really is more on the Black community and arming them with the tools they'll need to survive the next decade. That's my focus.
So Sharon, as we're leaving Black History Month, what's next for you in the research area? What's your next project?
My next project has come out of previous ones. It's about the emotional cost of activism. It's about how activists give of themselves, and that we don't always recognise that element, that can involve grief, rage, pain, and lots of difficult emotions. And the reason that I want to look at this, it's not inspiring, it would seem. If you're an activist and you're depressed or you're having a breakdown, that's not something that's shared with the groups with which you're working. How can that inspire? But at the same time, I think the fact that it's been hidden, that there are costs to activism, often emotional costs, often difficult costs that last a long time. Sometimes in the case of trauma, but that's not a word that I'm using in particular. I'm trying to be more precise about different emotions. I'm looking at that, and one of the reasons that I am is that one of the activists I wrote about in SNCC was incredibly important across the 1960s. And I came across him because he was the first person to write a novel as an activist about the civil rights movement, and he published it in 1969. A British publisher, an English publisher, perhaps difficult to publish in the US, I don't know, but we don't know that publishing history. But I do know that he wrote that novel at the end of his time as an activist, and he'd begun as a freedom rider. And all the way across the 60s, he wrote journalism, news articles. He was a Labour activist. He was really important. But then he fell away. He had a personal crisis. He left the movement. At the moment that he was breaking down, if you like, he was trying to put together a Black publishing house, and he didn't manage to do that. He was clearly an activist, but also a literary activist. And I wanted to know what had happened to him, and I found out, just as my book was coming out, that he was in a halfway house in Atlanta, Georgia, that he was living in this place because it was supporting people with issues of mental health and drug addiction issues. And I wanted him to read my book. I wanted him to read the chapter about him. I wanted him to know that he'd been valued and his writing had been valued. So I visited. And when I visited, he was no longer there. He'd been removed, I think. I can't remember what he'd done. Maybe he'd smoked in his room, or for some reason he was no longer there. And I left the book for him. I'd never expected to hear from him. It wasn't about that. It was a way of saying thank you, in a sense, and you were valued. But then I think I found an obituary online. And I do think that there are people that we've taken less account of, because he was not on the activist circuit. He wasn't giving lectures. He wasn't turning up at reunions. People like that can fall away and they get forgotten. And I don't want to forget him. So I do want to think a little bit more in ways that may be useful to contemporary activists too, about how you fight, how it can take an emotional toll, that it can tire you, it can weary you. That has a lot to do with Black history. It also has a lot to do with activists of other races and ethnicities too. But it came out of that feeling that we don't always see into all the corners of the history that we try to recoup, and some of them are difficult to see into than others. And privacy is a big issue in that, maybe we shouldn't see into all the corners. But I want to at least think philosophically, ethically, morally about, how we might do that, and perhaps see these activists who were damaged by their experience in the movement on equal memorial terms with other activists whose names we know.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us and sharing your wealth of experience and knowledge. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you'd like to find out more about Panya or Sharon's work, please have a look in the episode description. You've been listening to the Research Reimagined podcast by Nottingham Trent University. For all of the latest news from the research community at NTU, follow us on Twitter at NTU_research, or sign up to our research newsletter by visiting ntu.ac.uk/research. Thanks for listening.